The marble floor reflects the chandelier light in 10,000 fragments. Crystal hangs above like frozen tears. Outside, the winter night presses against the penthouse window so cold that frost creeps across the glass like veins. Inside Matteo Caruso's world, his empire, his fortress, his prison, everything stops. The boy convulses. 7 years old. Matteo Jr. sits strapped in his wheelchair, his small body rigid, his head thrown back, his eyes rolling until only the whites show. A sound comes from his throat that is not human. Not quite a scream. Not quite a breath. 2 guards in charcoal suits stand frozen against the far wall. Their hands rest on weapons they cannot use. Their training means nothing here. One of them swallows so hard you can hear it from across the room. The private doctor, 73 years old, brought in from Switzerland at tremendous cost, stammers into his phone. His fingers will not stop shaking. Words tumble out in 3 languages. None of them are helping. Matteo Caruso, age 42, drops to his knees beside the wheelchair. He is 6'3". 220 pounds of muscle built through 15 years of absolute power. His hands have signed papers that erased men from existence. His word has toppled empires smaller than cities. His scar, running from the corner of his left eye to his jawline, pale against dark skin, marks him as someone who has survived violence and emerged still dangerous. Now those hands tremble like a man in the final moments before death. No. No, no, no. His voice cracks. It sounds like something breaking. The paralysis gripping his son mirrors the paralysis that has gripped Matteo since the accident 3 years ago, when a rival's bullet severed the nerves in the boy's spine. Since that night, Matteo has been a man with all the power in the world and none of the answers. He can make people disappear. He cannot make his son walk. He can command armies. He cannot stop this. The boy's convulsions intensify. Then the door explodes inward. A woman in a grey hotel-maid uniform, stained at the collar, faded at the cuffs, moves through the room like a blade cutting through water. She is 28 years old, but her face carries the wear of someone twice that age. Her dark hair is pulled back so tight it seems to pain her scalp. Her eyes are brown, almost black, and in this moment they are the only thing in the room that is not frozen. She has never been in this room before. She has never been in this building before, except to clean the lower floors where the maids are permitted. She knows who Matteo Caruso is the way a sparrow knows about storms, as a force of nature that can destroy without intention or mercy. She does not hesitate. Lena Santos shoves past the guards. One of them reaches for her and she moves faster than he expects. She drops beside the wheelchair. Her hands, calloused from years of holding bleach bottles and scrubbing brushes, scarred from 1,000 small burns and cuts, move with absolute certainty. She tilts the boy's head back. She clears his airway. Her fingers work like she has done this 1,000 times, though she has only done it once, 3 years ago, when her own daughter Emma stopped breathing in the night. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. She counts compressions aloud. Her voice cuts through the silence like a blade. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. The room holds its breath. The boy gasps. A real breath. His body stills. His eyes flutter. Color returns to his lips. He breathes. He lives. Matteo Caruso stares at this woman kneeling in his marble world, this invisible woman in a stained uniform, and something fractures inside his chest so completely that he feels it in his bones. His hands are still shaking. His son is breathing. This woman, whom he has never seen, whom his world does not acknowledge, whom the universe has treated as if she does not exist, has just given him back his life. The private doctor stumbles forward, finally moving, finally useful. He checks the boy's pulse. His breathing. His pupils. His hands steady as he works. He is stable, the doctor says. His voice shakes. What you did, if you had not done that. He does not finish the sentence. He does not need to. They all know what happens when a 7-year-old boy stops breathing and no one is there to help him breathe again. Matteo rises to his feet. For the first time in years, his mind is completely clear. Not the clarity of a man planning vengeance. The clarity of a man who has just watched death walk past him, pausing only long enough to decide not to take his son. He looks at Lena Santos. Really looks at her. She is already backing away. Her uniform is soaked with the sweat of her own exertion. There is a small cut on her palm where she must have pressed too hard against the wheelchair. She moves like someone accustomed to making herself small, to taking up as little space as possible, to being forgiven for her existence. What is your name? Matteo's voice sounds different. Like a man speaking from underwater. Like thunder that has learned to whisper. Lena. Lena Santos. Her voice trembles like a candle in the wind. I should not have come up here. I saw the emergency light in the hallway. I heard the... You saved my son. The words are simple. Fact stated without emotion. But they settle into the room like a stone dropped into still water. Everything ripples outward from this moment. Everything changes. The guards exchange a look. In 15 years of service to Matteo Caruso, they have never seen him speak to a hotel maid. They have never heard his voice carry anything resembling gratitude. Tony, the older of the two, shifts his weight. Nino, younger and sharper, watches the scene with the intensity of a man understanding that he is witnessing something unprecedented. You should not be here. Matteo does not move closer. The space between them, a few feet of marble floor, might as well be an ocean. This is a private floor. A secure floor. I know. Lena's hands are still shaking. She clasps them together. I will go. I am sorry. Do you work in this hotel? Yes. I work housekeeping. I have worked here for 8 months. Her words come faster. She is afraid. Of him. Of what he is. Of what his world contains. I will lose my job for coming up here. But I thought there might be something I could. The doors burst open again. 2 more guards in black suits. Security. The people who are supposed to protect this space from intrusions. They see Lena and immediately move toward her. Matteo raises one hand. A single gesture. They freeze. Leave her. His voice carries the weight of absolute command. No one touches her. No one speaks to her harshly. She is not a security breach. She is a guest in my home, and she will be treated accordingly. Understand? The guards nod, confused but obedient. In their world, obedience is survival. Matteo turns back to Lena. What is your last name, Lena? Santos. And you live where? In an apartment. Near the quarter. It is not, she stops herself. Realizes she is about to apologize for the poverty her tone has already confessed. Near the quarter. Matteo studies her for a long moment. The private doctor is still tending to his son, checking vitals, confirming the boy's consciousness. The crisis has passed. The immediate danger has been averted. But something larger has begun, and Matteo feels it moving through the room like current through dark water. Thank you, Lena Santos, he says quietly. You have saved my son's life. That is a debt that cannot be repaid in ordinary currency. Lena does not know how to respond to that. Her whole life has been spent in a world where people do not acknowledge her. Where tips disappear from her pockets. Where supervisors speak to her as if she is furniture that has disappointed them by developing consciousness. To be seen, truly seen, by someone like Matteo Caruso feels like a kind of violence. I should go, she whispers. Not yet. Matteo reaches into his jacket and withdraws a wallet. The leather is soft, expensive, worth more than 3 months of her salary. He removes something from inside. Cash. Bills so new they have not been folded. He extends it toward her. Lena stares at his hand. The gold watch on his wrist. The silver ring on his thumb, the kind that men in his world wear to signal their position in hierarchies she does not understand. No, she says. The word surprises them both. You have earned. I did not do it for money. Your son was dying. A person was dying. I did what anyone would do. Matteo lowers his hand slightly. For the first time, something shifts in his expression. Not a smile. Something more dangerous than that. Something like recognition. You are right, he says. Anyone would do what you did. But no one did. Only you. Outside, the winter wind presses harder against the windows. The frost creeps further across the glass. In a few hours, the sun will rise over New Orleans. The city will wake. Douglas Hale will open the time card system at the Crescent Moon Hotel and see that Lena clocked out of her shift at 2:24 in the morning. He will make a note. He will remember. Margaret Harrington will sleep in her mansion on the other side of the city, unaware that something in the balance of her small empire is about to shift. Emma, Lena's daughter, will wake in their borrowed apartment and not understand where her mother has gone. But in this moment, suspended between midnight and dawn, between the world as it was and the world as it is about to become, Matteo Caruso and Lena Santos stand across a few feet of marble floor in a room lit by 10,000 fragments of crystal light. He is the most powerful man in New Orleans. She is a woman with $200 to her name. Neither of them knows that everything they have built, everything they believe about themselves, everything they thought they understood about survival and power and love, is about to be rewritten. Neither of them knows that in a few weeks, there will be fire. There will be destruction. There will be a choice that requires absolute courage. Neither of them knows that sometimes the people who seem most invisible carry the greatest light. But what would change everything was happening right now, in this moment, beneath the crystal chandeliers, where a widow's steady hands had just taught a Mafia boss that there are more kinds of power than the ones you can hold. Now, let us go back to the beginning. Let us understand how a woman with nothing, and a man with everything, arrived at this frozen night where death came close enough to touch them both. 3 weeks before the crystal chandeliers, before the mansion foyer, before a widow's steady hands changed everything, Lena Santos sat in a chair that was too hard and too small, across a desk from a man whose job was to crush people like her into dust. The office smelled like old coffee and the leather of a briefcase that cost more than her rent. A window behind the desk showed the New Orleans skyline, gray and indifferent. The man across from her was named Victor Castellano, and he did not look up when she entered. He finished writing something, his pen moving with the precision of someone who had signed away 1,000 futures, then he slid a stack of papers across the desk like he was dealing cards in a game she could not win. $300,000, he said. His voice was flat, administrative, the voice of a machine that sorted human beings into categories, pay or disappear. Your late husband's name. Your signature on these documents. You are responsible. The papers fanned across the mahogany like a death sentence in triplicate. Lena had known this was coming. She had known since the day the detective knocked on her apartment door 6 months ago with the news that Marcus was dead, killed where his car wrapped around a telephone pole on Magazine Street at 2 in the morning, and then, 3 days later, when the first creditor called. She had known when she opened the filing cabinet in the bedroom they had shared and found the loan documents, the forged signatures, the gambling receipts with dates that went back 7 years. 7 years of lies accumulated like water behind a cracking dam, and she had been living downstream the whole time without knowing it. But knowing and seeing were different things. Seeing made it real. I don't have that money, Lena said. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. My husband never told me. I didn't know about any of this. Victor Castellano finally looked at her. He was a man in his 60s with the soft face of someone who had never worked with his hands, but his eyes were sharp as a knife's edge. That is not my concern. You have 3 days to arrange payment, or we begin asset seizure. Your apartment, your car, your daughter's savings account if she has one. Whatever you own, we take it. 3 days. 72 hours. The clock that had been running in the background of Lena's life since Marcus died had just been made audible. You could hear it now, ticking. Loud. She left the office at 4:17 in the afternoon. The elevator descended slowly, passing floor after floor of offices where people with jobs that paid money sat at desks and moved papers around. Lena had worked since she was 16. She had never not worked. But 16 years of working had taught her one thing: there were people the world was designed for, and there were people the world was designed to crush. She was beginning to understand which category she belonged to. The bus ride home took 40 minutes. She sat by the window and watched the city move past her, the French Quarter with its wrought iron balconies and expensive restaurants where she would never eat, the warehouses being converted into apartments that cost more than she made in a year, the neighborhoods where the houses had gardens and the people had time to tend them. Emma was at school. Lena's mother was watching her until 5 o'clock, which meant Lena had 1 hour to figure out what she was going to do with the rest of her life. The apartment was a one-bedroom in a building that had been condemned twice and survived through the indifference of city inspectors. The walls were thin enough that you could hear the neighbor's television through them. The stove had 2 working burners. The refrigerator made a sound like a dying animal at 3 in the morning. This was home. This was all she had left. She opened the filing cabinet again and pulled out her bank statement. $200. That was what remained after 6 months of double shifts and skipped meals and the funeral that had cost $3,000, even though she had chosen the cheapest casket, the smallest plot, the service that lasted 15 minutes. $200 stood between her and absolute nothing. $200 to feed Emma, to pay the electric bill, to buy the medication for her mother's blood pressure. $200 to hold back the darkness for another week. She put the statement back. She did not cry. Her tears had dried up somewhere between the detective's car and the funeral home, and she had not found them since. At 5 o'clock, her mother brought Emma home. Her mother was thin and breathless, the way she had been since the heart attack 3 years earlier. Emma was 6 years old and her shoes had holes in the soles. You could see the wear on her heel, the pale flesh where the rubber had given way. They had been her size a year ago. She had grown, but Lena could not afford to replace them. How was work? Her mother asked. She already knew the answer was bad. She could see it in Lena's face the way she could see everything that mattered. Fine. Long shift tomorrow. I'm closing, so I won't be home until 3 in the morning. Her mother nodded and did not ask about the debt collector because she already knew about that too. The whole family knew. The knowledge sat in the room with them like a fifth person, taking up space, making everything smaller. Emma climbed into her mother's lap. She was still small enough to fit, though not for much longer. She smelled like the school cafeteria, something fried and salty and generic. Lena pressed her face into her daughter's hair and held her, and thought about the apartment they would lose, the school Emma would have to change, the other children who would know that her mother could not provide, that they were the kind of people who fell, not the kind who rose. The Crescent Moon Hotel stood on Bourbon Street like a monument to a world Lena could never truly belong to. She had worked there for 3 years, which meant she had spent 4,800 hours walking its hallways, emptying its trash cans, replacing its towels, scrubbing the stains left by people who had money enough to destroy things without thinking about the cost. The lobby was all marble and crystal chandeliers that cost more than she made in a year. Each crystal piece was roughly the size of a child's fist. She had counted them once during a slow shift, 10,214 pieces. The light moved through them like it was moving through a kingdom of ice. The night manager was Douglas Hale. He was a man in his late 40s with hair slicked back with something that made it shine, and a suit that probably cost $800. He had been hired 3 months ago, and in those 3 months, the whole staff had learned to fear him. He worked the night shift and he operated under a philosophy that was simple and absolute: the hotel's guests came first, second, and third, and everyone who worked there was expendable beneath that absolute mandate. "You're late," Douglas said when Lena clocked in at 11:58, which meant she was 2 minutes early, but this was how Douglas worked. He created small injustices constantly, like he was testing to see how much the staff would tolerate. This was part of his method. This was how he established dominion. "I'm early," Lena said. She kept her voice neutral. "Your attitude suggests otherwise. Room 1502 needs fresh linens. The guest called down an hour ago. The fact that you weren't here to answer that call tells me everything I need to know about your commitment to this hotel." He turned away before she could respond. This was also part of his method. Statements without dialogue. Accusations without the possibility of defense. The room on the 15th floor was a suite that rented for $600 a night. The couple inside had requested privacy, which meant Lena knocked and waited and then used her key when no one answered. They were sleeping. She moved quietly, replacing the towels in the bathroom, emptying the trash. The room smelled like expensive perfume and sex and the specific staleness that came from too many bodies breathing the same air in an enclosed space. When she bent to pick up the trash near the sofa, her hand touched something solid. A wallet. Black leather, the kind that probably cost as much as she made in a month. She opened it. Cash, $2,000, which was more money than she had seen in years, the kind of money that could stop time, that could buy a different future. Credit cards with a name, Matteo Caruso. And a photograph. A woman. Dark eyes. Young, maybe late 20s, wearing a dress that was clearly expensive and smiling at the camera with the unself-conscious joy of someone who had never known scarcity. The photograph was old, the edges were worn, the color beginning to fade. Whatever joy this woman had known, it was long gone now. Lena could take the cash. She could walk out of the hotel, go to a different city, change her name, start over. The money would buy her 48 hours. 48 hours to breathe. 48 hours before the collection agency found her again. But she slid the wallet into her apron and clipped it closed. At midnight, when her shift was over, she went to the front desk. "I need the address for someone staying here." Matteo Caruso. Penthouse. The front desk manager, a woman named Christine who had worked there longer than Lena and had learned to protect the hotel's guests like they were her own children, shook her head. "You know I can't give you that. I found his wallet. I need to return it." Christine's expression softened slightly. She typed something into the computer and wrote an address on a piece of paper. "Don't tell anyone I gave this to you." The address was in the Garden District, where the houses had columns and gates and the kind of silence that comes from money old enough to know its own power. Lena took 2 buses. The night was clear and cold, the kind of December night when the air feels sharp enough to cut, and the stars overhead were so bright they looked almost angry, burning against the darkness like something was wrong with the sky. The gates were wrought iron, 12 feet high, and there was a security camera mounted above the intercom. Lena rang the bell and waited. Nothing happened for a long time, and then a man appeared on the other side of the gate. He was large, maybe 6'3", with a scar that ran from his right eye down to his jawline, and he was looking at her like she was a problem that needed solving. "I found a wallet that belongs to someone staying here," Lena said. "Matteo Caruso. I need to return it." The man did not move. His eyes traveled over her like she was something he was cataloging, something he was memorizing for later. "Where did you find it?" "At the Crescent Moon Hotel. I work there. I found it in a guest room." The scar on his face moved when he spoke, pulling slightly. "You should have given it to the hotel. I wanted to return it personally." The man considered this. Then he pressed something on the intercom and said nothing, just silence, and then the gate began to swing open. "Come with me." What Lena didn't know was that Matteo Caruso had called Tony and Nino 45 minutes earlier and told them that someone had taken his wallet from the penthouse. What she didn't know was that in the Caruso family, taking anything was a form of disrespect, and disrespect was a disease that had to be removed before it spread. What she didn't know was that she had just walked through a gate that might close behind her with her still on the wrong side of it, and that sometimes the kindest thing a person could do was the thing that changed everything. The marble foyer fell into absolute silence. Every breath held. every heartbeat suspended in the space between catastrophe and salvation. Matteo Caruso stood motionless at the edge of the Persian rug, his hand still trembling, still reaching toward his son who now breathed, who now lived, who moments ago had been slipping away into the dark. The boy's chest rose and fell. Rose and fell. The nurses clustered around him, checking vitals with shaking fingers, whispering prayers in Italian that no one had heard in this house for 7 years. But Matteo saw only one thing. The woman in the stained uniform walking toward the elevator. Her hand moving to press the button. Her exhausted face turned away. Her shoulders already bracing for dismissal, for the return to invisibility, for the world that had always told her she was nobody worth remembering. He moved without thinking, which was something Matteo Caruso never did. He always thought. He calculated. He strategized 17 moves ahead like a chess master reading the board before the game began. But this moment shattered every careful discipline he had built over 15 years of ruling New Orleans underworld with an iron fist wrapped in Italian silk. Wait. His voice cut through the elevator shaft like a blade through silence. Not a request. A command that had bent armies to his will. Lena's hand froze on the button. She didn't turn around. Turn around. She turned. And when their eyes met, something in Matteo's chest fractured open like old stone finally breaking under pressure it had carried for too long. She was smaller than he remembered. More fragile. Her hair had come loose from its braid during CPR, falling across her face in dark strands. Her uniform bore a coffee stain on the collar and what looked like blood, his son's blood, smeared across her wrist. Her eyes were red-rimmed, the kind of red that came from too many nights without sleep, too many shifts that never ended, too many times the world had hurt her and she had simply stood back up. "Who are you?" he asked, though he already knew. Though Tony had given him the name. Though he had spent the last 3 days unable to explain why a woman who returned a lost wallet had haunted him like a ghost he couldn't lay to rest. "Lena Santos," she said quietly. Her voice was barely above a whisper, the kind of voice that had learned to take up as little space as possible. "I returned your wallet. 3 days ago." Matteo's breath caught. The wallet. The photograph of Isabella inside it. The wife he had loved like oxygen and lost like drowning. This woman had held that photograph in her hands and brought it back to him instead of disappearing into the city like every other person would have done. Tony and Nino exchanged a look that neither of them could explain. In 15 years of walking beside Matteo Caruso, in 15 years of watching him command respect through fear and violence and absolute control, they had never seen him look at another human being like this. Like she had given him something he didn't know he was missing. Like she had pulled him from underwater and he had just realized he had been drowning. "You saved his life," Matteo said. His voice had changed. It was no longer the instrument of power that moved men to action. It was something raw. Something that sounded almost like gratitude. Almost like prayer. Lena shook her head. "I'm glad he's okay. That's all that matters." "You're bleeding." He stepped closer and she didn't move away, though every instinct in her body probably screamed at her to run from a man this dangerous, this powerful, this close. He took her wrist gently, and the gentleness itself was shocking, the gentleness itself was wrong, the gentleness itself was the most terrifying thing that had happened all night. "You're injured." "It's nothing. I'm fine." "What's your name?" "I just told you." "Lena Santos." "No." He was still holding her wrist, and his thumb traced across the small cuts on her palm where the boy's teeth had scraped during the compressions. "What is your life? Who are you beyond this moment?" Lena pulled her hand back carefully, respectfully, the way someone retrieves their hand from the edge of a cliff. "I work at the hotel. I should get back. People will notice I'm gone." "No one notices you're gone." The question hung in the air between them like smoke. Like something toxic that had poisoned her entire existence without anyone ever naming it. "No," Lena said. "They don't." Matteo turned to Tony, and in that single glance, an entire conversation happened. The kind of wordless communication that only developed between men who had bled together, who had buried enemies together, who had built an empire on absolute loyalty and unquestioned obedience. Find everything, Matteo said. Her debts. Her losses. Every person who has hurt her. Every debt, every threat, every cruel thing that has been done in her name. I want the complete picture before sunrise. Boss, Tony said carefully, are you sure? Before sunrise, Tony. Tony nodded once and pulled out his phone. Within seconds, Nino was on his secure line, and the machinery of Matteo's organization began to move. Calls were made. Favors were invoked. Records were accessed through channels that existed in the spaces between law and chaos. Lena watched this happen and something cold moved through her chest. What are you doing? Matteo turned back to her. What I should have done the moment you walked through my gates 3 days ago. I don't want anything from you, Mr. Caruso. I know. He smiled, and it transformed his entire face. The scar on his jaw seemed to recede. The hardness in his eyes softened into something almost human. That's why you're the only person in New Orleans I would trust with my son's life. The elevator chimed behind her. The door slid open to reveal an empty shaft, a way out, a return to the life of invisibility she had inhabited for so long that she had stopped believing any other life was possible. Go home, Matteo said. Rest. Tomorrow, everything changes. Lena stepped into the elevator and pressed the ground floor button. As the doors closed, she saw him still watching her, his jaw set, his hands opening and closing into fists. She saw Tony on his phone, his expression grim. She saw Nino whispering into his secure radio. And what she didn't know, what no one except Matteo understood in that moment, was that she had just triggered something immense. That somewhere in this city, Douglas Hale was at home counting the tips he had stolen from her, planning his next cruelty. That Margaret Harrington was in her penthouse, reviewing security footage and preparing her next public humiliation. That both of them believed they lived in a world where consequences were optional, where small people could be crushed without repercussion, where a widow with nothing could never pose a threat. All of that was about to change. The elevator descended. Lena watched the numbers drop from 15 to 10 to 5. Her reflection stared back at her from the polished steel walls, a woman in a stained uniform, holding the wages of cruelty in her exhausted eyes, carrying the weight of survival in her bent shoulders. But something was different now. Something had shifted in the architecture of her life. Outside, the New Orleans night was cold, the kind of cold that cut through fabric and skin and deep into the bone. Lena walked toward the bus stop, counting the blocks, counting her steps, counting the hours until dawn. She didn't know that Matteo Caruso was currently on his secure line with the federal prosecutor's office, presenting them with evidence of corruption so extensive, so documented, so undeniable that by sunrise, warrants would be issued. She didn't know that Douglas Hale's apartment was already being watched by men who never blinked, who never slept, who remembered every crime he had committed because Matteo's organization made it their business to remember. She didn't know that Margaret Harrington's bank accounts were being traced through layers of shell corporations, that her social connections were being documented, that her entire fragile empire of cruelty was about to come crashing down under the weight of her own greed. She only knew that for the first time in 3 years, someone had looked at her and seen her. Not as a problem. Not as an inconvenience. Not as a nobody who could be hurt without consequence. But as someone who mattered. The bus arrived at exactly 11:41 p.m. Lena climbed aboard and took a seat near the back, pressing her forehead against the cold window. In the penthouse 15 floors above the city, Matteo Caruso stood alone in the hallway outside his son's room. The boy slept now, breathing steadily, his chest rising and falling like a metronome, keeping time with a heart that was still beating because a woman in a stained uniform had refused to let him disappear. He pulled out the wallet. Opened it. Stared at the photograph of Isabella, the woman who had given him everything and taken everything with her when the pregnancy turned to poison and the doctors said there was nothing they could do. Then he looked at the prayer card that had fallen from the wallet when Lena returned it. He had never examined it closely before. Now he turned it over in his hands and read the words printed on the back. In the darkest hour, light is not diminished. It is simply waiting to be seen. And Matteo understood, in a way that years of violence and power had never taught him, that sometimes the people you were meant to save were the ones who saved you first. The cold wind cut through the Crescent Moon Hotel's marble lobby like a blade wrapped in ice. Lena stood in the center of that vast, echoing space, the kind of space designed to make ordinary people feel small. The morning light fell through floor-to-ceiling windows in sharp, accusatory angles. Margaret Harrington sat behind an executive desk that cost more than everything Lena had ever owned, her fingers steepled, her smile the kind that predators wear before they strike. Beside her stood Douglas Hale, his jaw clenched tight, his breath coming in short, controlled bursts through his nose. Margaret slid a termination letter across the polished surface. The paper made a sound like a death sentence being pronounced. "We reviewed the security footage," Margaret said, each word measured, deliberate, designed to land like a fist. "You were caught stealing from guest rooms. Room for 12. Room 508. The penthouse safe on the 14th floor." Her eyes glittered with the particular satisfaction of someone about to destroy another human being and calling it justice. "You're terminated, effective immediately. 1 hour to clear your locker. Security will escort you out." Lena's hands trembled. "I never stole anything. I would never." "The footage doesn't lie," Douglas interrupted, stepping closer, his voice dropping to a hiss. "I saw it myself. And I'm going to make sure every hotel manager in this city knows your name. Every restaurant, every casino, every place that might have hired you." He leaned in, his breath hot and rancid against her ear. "You'll never work in this city again. You'll be marked. Unemployable. Finished." The words landed like stones thrown into still water, each one sending out ripples of devastation. Lena opened her mouth. Closed it. There was nothing to say. There was no defense against a lie told by people with power and spoken into the ears of other people with power. The truth meant nothing when you had nothing. She walked out of that office on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. The hotel steps were frozen. Winter had settled over New Orleans like a curse that could not be erased. Lena stood at the edge of the street, the cold air burning in her lungs, and felt something crack inside her chest. Emma's school tuition was due in 3 days. 3 days. She had $200 to her name. 200. The math was simple and absolute and merciless. $200 would not save her daughter. It would not pay rent on an apartment that had already burned to ash. It would not erase the $300,000 debt hanging around her neck like a noose made of paper and numbers and her dead husband's broken promises. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the prayer card. The one she had carried since the fire. The paper was soft now from handling, the corners bent and worn smooth. In the darkest hour, light is not diminished. It is simply waiting to be seen. The words blurred as her vision filled with tears she had thought were spent, used up, dried to nothing on 1,000 sleepless nights. Emma's face flashed in her mind, her daughter's laugh, the way she trusted that Mommy would fix everything, that Mommy would find a way, that Mommy would never let anything bad happen. Emma's belief was so absolute, so pure, so utterly dependent on Lena's ability to perform miracles with $200 and a prayer card. Her fingers closed around the worn paper. The river was 3 blocks away. The water would be cold this time of year. Probably mercifully cold. Fast. She would not have to suffer long. She would not have to face Emma's tears when the eviction notice came. She would not have to watch her daughter's faith shatter like glass when she realized Mommy could not save her, could not save them, could not save anything at all. Lena's hand dropped. No. Not today. Not for them. She walked back into the hotel through a service entrance, her head down, her shoulders pulled tight. She found a bathroom on the 3rd floor and locked herself in a stall. The tears came then, violent and ugly, racking her body like a seizure. She cried for everything lost. For her husband. For her burned apartment. For her burned future. For the cruelty of people who had everything deciding to destroy people who had nothing. For the fundamental unfairness of a universe that allowed this. That allowed Margaret Harrington and Douglas Hale to exist in the same city as Lena Santos, breathing the same air, walking under the same sky. She cried until there was nothing left inside her but a hollow kind of resolve. Meanwhile, across the city in a penthouse office overlooking the river, Matteo Caruso received a report that would change everything. Tony sat across from him, a folder thick with documentation spread across the mahogany desk between them. Photographs. Bank records. Depositions from frightened hotel employees who had taken years to gather the courage to speak. Tony's voice was steady, professional, but beneath it ran a current of quiet rage. Douglas Hale has been systematically stealing tips from hotel staff for 6 years, Tony said, each factor nail being driven into a coffin. 43 employees robbed. $180,000. Margaret Harrington falsely accused 12 workers of theft to avoid paying severance. She kept the money. $340,000. They crushed people systematically. Methodically. Like it was a game. Matteo did not move. Did not speak. His face became something carved from stone, something that no longer resembled a human being but rather a sculpture of fury held in perfect suspension. Lena Santos. Fired this morning. False theft accusations. The evidence is fabricated. We have the real security footage. We have her personnel file showing no infractions in 3 years. We have Douglas Hale's own texts discussing the false accusation. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that precedes violence. Matteo stood and walked to the window. Below, the city sprawled in its ordinary indifference, millions of people going about their ordinary lives, unaware that someone had just made a decision that would reshape the geography of consequence. He picked up his phone and made 2 calls. Precise. Brief. Devastating. At 2 a.m., Douglas Hale woke in his apartment to the sound of his bedroom door opening. He did not remember falling asleep. He did not remember what he had dreamed. What he did remember was the sudden, suffocating certainty that he was about to die. 12 men stood in the darkness. They were dressed in black suits that cost more than his monthly salary. They moved with the synchronization of a perfectly choreographed machine. One of them, a man with shoulders like a linebacker and a scar running from his left temple down to his jaw, stepped forward and grabbed him by the throat. His name was Tony. "Mr. Caruso sends his regards," Tony said, his voice like the rumble of distant thunder. Douglas screamed. Actually screamed, the sound torn from his throat, raw and pathetic and filled with the sudden, devastating understanding that there was no escaping what came next. He begged. He promised. He offered money, information, anything. The men did not respond. They dragged him down 3 flights of stairs and threw him into the back of a black SUV that was already running, engine idling, ready to depart. At 2:15 a.m., across the city in a mansion built on 3 generations of inherited wealth, Margaret Harrington's security system failed. Not malfunctioned. Failed. Deliberately. 6 men entered through the front door like they owned the place. Like they had always owned it. Nino, a man with cold eyes and a smile that had never reached anything deeper than his face, walked directly to her bedroom. The other 5 men flanked him like pallbearers. Margaret woke to the sensation of hands grabbing her by the hair. She tried to scream. Nino covered her mouth with one hand, the other pressing something cold and metallic against her temple. Not a gun, but something sharp. Something that made the message clear without words. "You destroyed the wrong woman," Nino said, and there was something almost gentle in his voice, which made it infinitely worse. "You destroyed a woman who mattered to someone who can hurt people in ways you do not have the vocabulary to imagine." Margaret tried to threaten. Tried to remind them of her connections, her lawyers, her power. Nino shook his head with something like pity. "Too late," he said. The warehouse on the docks was 8 stories tall and completely empty except for one concrete room and the 2 people who had been delivered there at 3:08 in the morning. Matteo Caruso did not attend their delivery. He did not need to witness it. He already knew what was happening. What would continue happening? What would eventually end when the Moretti family, Matteo's oldest rivals, the family he had been at war with for 15 years, decided that their curiosity had been satisfied? The Morettis wanted leverage. Matteo had given them leverage. 2 people who carried secrets about the Crescent Moon Hotel, about its operations, about the network of connections that kept it running. 2 people whose knowledge was suddenly worth more to the Morettis than they were worth alive. Douglas Hale and Margaret Harrington were never seen again. Their disappearance made the news for one day. By the second day, other stories had eclipsed them. By the third day, they were simply missing persons, the kind of people who vanished into the river of New Orleans's unsolved cases and were eventually forgotten, like names written in sand as the tide came in. No bodies were ever recovered. No confessions were ever extracted. There was simply silence, the kind of silence that speaks louder than any scream. What came next was almost surgical in its precision. Federal authorities received an anonymous tip about financial irregularities at the Crescent Moon Hotel. They arrived with warrants and subpoenas and cold institutional efficiency. Within a week, they had uncovered 40 years of embezzlement, fraud, and systematic labor violations. The hotel was seized, investigated, sold at auction to a legitimate business consortium with no connections to organized crime. Lena Santos received a notification on her phone on a Tuesday morning. A bank transfer. $300,000. Every penny of her debt. Every obligation. Every consequence of her dead husband's failures, finally, devastatingly erased. A note came with it. Printed. Anonymous. Professional. Your slate is clean. Start again. She stood in her borrowed apartment, holding her phone, unable to breathe. Emma was at school. Emma did not know yet that the world had tilted. That the mathematics of survival had changed. That sometimes light did not simply wait to be seen. Sometimes light arrived like lightning, violent and absolute, reshaping everything it touched. The city beyond the window was ordinary. Traffic moved. People walked. Birds flew in patterns that made no sense except to themselves. And somewhere in this city, in a penthouse overlooking water that had seen centuries of sins and sorrows, Matteo Caruso sat in silence and thought about a woman in a stained uniform who had saved his son's life and asked for nothing in return but the opportunity to remain invisible. 1 year later, and the city of New Orleans has forgotten Lena Santos almost as completely as it forgot Douglas Hale and Margaret Harrington. Almost. The Crescent Moon Hotel still stands on Bourbon Street, but under different management now, under hands that do not steal from the vulnerable and mouths that do not threaten those beneath them. The federal investigation lasted 8 weeks. By the end, 40 years of embezzlement had surfaced like bodies in the bayou. By the end, Margaret Harrington's name appeared in every major news outlet alongside words like fraud, corruption, systematic abuse of power. By the end, she was gone. Not dead. Something worse. She retained the best lawyers money could buy, but money could not buy back her social standing, could not reconstruct the empire of control she had built brick by brick, humiliation by humiliation. She sits now in a federal minimum security facility upstate, serving a 12-year sentence, her name synonymous with everything she despised: invisibility, irrelevance, powerlessness. Douglas Hale's fate carried a different kind of finality. He was simply missing. Some said he fled to Mexico. Some whispered he was sleeping in the river. The authorities never found enough evidence to charge him formally. They did not need to. His name was radioactive now, toxic, the kind of name that cleared rooms and ended conversations. What mattered was that he was gone. Erased. As if he had never existed at all. And Lena Santos, the woman who had been invisible, had become something entirely different. She stood in a cream-colored apartment in the French Quarter, sunlight streaming through tall windows that overlooked a courtyard where banana trees grew wild and flowers bloomed in defiance of winter. Her hands, once cracked and bleeding from bleach and hot water, were now smooth, capable, confident. She wore a white coat over navy scrubs, and the stethoscope draped around her neck caught the light like a talisman. Pediatric nurse. Top of her class at New Orleans General Hospital. The diploma framed on her bedroom wall read her name in silver letters, Lena Maria Santos, RN. Emma was at school, attending a private academy now, the kind of place where the teachers knew every student's name and the classroom smelled like fresh paint instead of mildew and desperation. She came home with drawings in her backpack and stories on her lips, her laughter filling the apartment like music that had learned to trust the world again. She was 7 now, old enough to remember the fire as a nightmare that had faded, not old enough to understand how close they had come to not surviving at all. The anonymous bank transfer had arrived on a Tuesday morning, the same morning that federal warrants were being executed against Margaret Harrington's accounts, the same morning that Douglas Hale's apartment was being raided by agents in dark suits and darker dispositions. $300,000. Every penny of the debt her dead husband had left her. Every obligation. Every consequence, finally, devastatingly erased. There was no name on the transfer. No explanation. Just a printed note in the bank envelope, your slate is clean. Start again. Lena had read it 17 times, holding the paper with trembling hands, unable to breathe, unable to understand why the universe had decided to stop crushing her. She never asked who had sent it. After the first week of confusion, after the first sleepless nights trying to construct a logic that made sense, she simply decided not to know. Some mysteries, she learned, were kinder than their answers. Some gifts were larger when they remained anonymous, when gratitude could not calcify into obligation. She paid off the debt within a month. Then she enrolled in nursing school. Now, 1 year later, her life was a thing with structure and dignity. Bills that came with the expectation that she would pay them. A salary that was hers to keep, earned by her hands, her knowledge, her 18-hour shifts in pediatric wards where children with recovering lungs and healing hearts looked at her like she was the person holding back the darkness. She was not invisible anymore. In the hospital, people knew her name. They called for her by choice, not by accident. They thanked her. They trusted her with their most precious things. But sometimes, in the hollow space between waking and sleeping, she thought about that wallet. About the man who had dismissed her with money she refused. About eyes that had haunted her like a question she did not know how to ask. The fundraiser invitation arrived by courier on a Thursday afternoon. Gold lettering on cream cardstock. A gala at the penthouse overlooking the river, benefiting the pediatric wing of New Orleans General Hospital. Black tie. 6 o'clock. The name of the host was printed at the bottom, small enough to almost miss, Matteo Caruso Foundation for Children's Health. Lena read it 3 times. She did not go. She told herself it was coincidence, that New Orleans was full of men with Italian names, that the city was vast enough to contain both their stories without them ever touching again. But Emma came home from school and said the hospital had closed early for staff who wanted to attend, said her teacher Mrs. Chen had made a comment about going to see the beautiful building on the river, said there was a boy who would be there, Matteo Caruso's son, who had started school this year, who was kind and quiet and walked with braces made of titanium and determination. Lena did not plan to go. She found herself, at 5:45 in the evening, standing in front of her closet in a black dress that was simple and expensive, a dress that said she could afford beauty without demanding attention. She found herself in a taxi moving through the French Quarter toward the river. She found herself in an elevator that rose like a prayer, up and up and up, until the city below became small enough to hold in your palm. The penthouse was full of doctors and nurses and hospital administrators, people in dark suits discussing charitable tax incentives and pediatric innovation. Lena moved through them like a ghost, like a shadow that refused to leave, until she found the balcony overlooking the frozen city. Frost coated everything like diamonds. The river below moved with the patience of something that had seen centuries of sins and sorrows and would outlast them all. She stood alone at the railing, her breath misting in the cold, when a voice behind her said, "You never came to collect." She turned. Matteo Caruso stood in a dark suit that fit him like a second skin, his hair shot through with silver now, his eyes carrying something that looked like vulnerability, a look that did not belong on a face as powerful as his. Behind him, through the glass doors, she could see his son, healthy and walking with the determined gait of someone who had learned to move through the world despite its resistance. Tony stood nearby, grinning. Nino was pouring champagne. "Collect what?" Lena's voice was barely a whisper, a sound fragile as paper. Matteo stepped closer. "I owe you everything. You saved my son. You asked for nothing. You expected less. I tried to find you after that night, to repay you properly, but you disappeared." "I didn't disappear," Lena said. "I rebuilt." Matteo studied her face like it was a map to something he had lost and never expected to find again. "The debts. The apartment. The school tuition. That was you." He nodded before she could answer. "Everything anonymous. Untraceable." Lena's eyes filled with water that blurred the city lights into watercolor. "Why? You didn't know me." "I knew enough," Matteo said, his voice deep and solid like an oath. "From the moment you returned that wallet, from the moment you knelt beside my son when every guard froze, I saw you. A woman drowning, asking for nothing, carrying a light I'd forgotten existed." Lena wiped her eyes with her palm. "I don't know what to say." Matteo smiled, and it was fragile and real in a way that men like him are rarely allowed to be. "Say you'll let me take you to dinner. Say you'll let me prove that not everyone in this city is Douglas Hale or Margaret Harrington. Say you'll give me a chance to be something other than the man I've been." Inside, Tony whispered to Nino, "In 15 years, I've never seen him look at anyone like that." Nino grinned. "About time." Lena looked at this powerful man rendered vulnerable by honesty, at his son watching through the glass with curiosity, at the frozen city spread below them like a second chance waiting to be lived. She nodded. 1 month later, they sat on the same balcony under stars sharp as diamonds. Emma played inside with Matteo's son, their laughter echoing through the penthouse like music, learning to trust the world. Matteo held Lena's hand, her fingers small against his, her skin warm. "I spent 15 years building an empire on vengeance," he said. "I thought power was the only language that mattered. Then you showed me that sometimes the people who seem invisible carry the greatest light." Lena leaned against his shoulder. "I spent a year drowning, thinking I had to do it alone. You showed me it's okay to let someone help carry the weight." Matteo kissed her forehead, and in that gesture was every apology he could never say, every thank you he could never adequately express, every promise he had learned to mean. "We saved each other," he whispered. Around them, the city of New Orleans moved in its eternal rhythms, traffic flowing like blood through stone, the river turning, the wind carrying stories too old and too new to count. Somewhere in the darkness, federal detention facilities held those who had tried to crush her. Somewhere else, the Crescent Moon Hotel operated under new management, under hands that understood dignity. And here, on this balcony, under these stars, two people who had been broken in different ways learned that sometimes light does not wait to be discovered. Sometimes light arrives like a blade through darkness, violent and absolute, reshaping everything it touches, making invisible people visible, making broken people whole. This is what happens when grace arrives wearing a name. This is what happens when the universe finally says yes. This story teaches us that even in the darkest moments, love finds a way. If you believe that, hit like and subscribe. Leave a comment and tell us how this story made you feel. Thank you for staying with us until the very end.